So Liv, while you're doing that, and Joseph, thanks again for being here. And one of the things you were mentioning earlier, as folks are joining us for this session, you were mentioning about how geographic data analysis and these really amazing tools can be challenging when people feel like maybe there isn't the data in the spaces where they are. And I am so excited that at this event, we have people representing projects all around the globe, including the polar regions, both poles. So what do you see when it comes to the expanse of data available globally and the ability to make best use of these tools?
Yeah, great question, Jennifer. Thanks for having me today. Really appreciate being with you and all of your good people out there. I would say there's a couple of things happening that are noteworthy to look at. First of all, the value of data is starting to be recognized. There are research papers about, hey, why don't we couple the actual data with some scholarly research? Why hasn't that traditionally been done? So there's that movement. There's also the open data movement where governments and nonprofits and private industry, even in academia, are saying, we're going to serve up an open data portal where we're providing this as a value, a service to the community. I was at the USGS working away way back, not too many years ago, when the year that the Landsat data became globally available. Instead of it was $800 a scene, for those of you that remember way back when, 2006-ish, and then, hey, let's just make this available. And then, of course, the use skyrocketed, and so many more applications and wiser decision making and all the rest of it. So, and then coupled with all of those sorts of movements is, of course, the citizen science movement, where you've got, hey, I don't have pH or dissolved oxygen or something like that in a wetland or a river near me or in this location where I'm studying. I can go collect that and then upload it to these sets of tools and platforms where I can serve up that data, where not only I can access it from anywhere, any device, anytime, but so can the community. So I think it's a perfect convergence of a lot of those things. Now, coupled with that is, okay, how do we know if data is any good? Data quality. Oftentimes maps have this sort of authoritative air to them, right? They seem like it's a map and therefore it's authoritative. It's got a good quality source. We'll talk about that later, but that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about as an educator and a geographer, is getting people to be using mapped information, geospatial information carefully, but also having a critical eye on it, really asking the deep questions about who created it, when it was created, how it was created, how often it was updated, what scale it was created at, and so on. So anyway, thanks, Jennifer.
Oh, yeah.
Much appreciated.
It's great to have you here. And, that aspect of learning how to think critically about all of these tools, I think, is just such an important skill. And I usually hear that question, although we feel like we're moving out of that area with citizen science, but I feel like I used to hear that question a lot. How do we know those data are any good? And I hadn't thought about that in terms of maps before, but of course there's the whole book that was published at one point, How to Lie with Maps, I think is.
Yeah, it's kind of essential reading for all undergraduates these days. That I love that book, Mark Monmonier. Yep.
Yeah, but with all of these things, right, they're the tools that we have to and thinking critically about the way any of these tools function, the way that we do science, no matter who's doing it, is something we have to be thinking so closely about and weaving into the stories that we tell, right? And Calvin, I know that's something that you are always excited to talk about, is the storytelling aspect of some of these like story maps.
Absolutely. My background in air quality and community-based science is pretty geographic. It was all about proximity to health risks. And so there was no way we could look at our air sensor data or look at air pollution permits or look at where communities would reside and where health concerns were without thinking where as a geography, right, question. All of our questions were geographic questions. And Joseph, I think you're so right. It wasn't just USGS data that became so available. The barrier to entry for the GIS field and the technical side of computational geography and the big data sets that might be out there were very siloed. They were kept in private haystacks sometimes, right? They could be public, they could be private. They weren't out there for everyone. Now, you can get a hold of amazing data sets from government sources and academic sources, but also communities that have been the best available contributors for that information at the same time. And I think Esri deserves some credit for broadening the participant bank of who can use authoritative data, who can contribute authoritative data, and then what sense can be made out of it, what applications can be built with it, and then what outcomes can the community, can businesses, can governments have by using data that is more freely shared. And so that's just fantastic. It's been awesome to watch the field explode that way.
Indeed. And the another nice thing about all of this is that, you know, the ultimate goal, the bigger and more noble goal, is that wiser decisions are made because people have the data, including the geospatial data, at their fingertips, a wide variety and a wide variety of quality, but they can make the smartest decisions possible. Unlike the clunkier older days when, like you said, Calvin, even if you could get the data, it was sometimes hours, days before you could actually get to the analysis stage, just because the formats were so, you know, obtuse and difficult to use.
Yeah, absolutely. You had to kind of be a computer scientist to really even get into GIS data. And then itself was its own little pocket of computer science. And you really had to be good with Krieging and understanding, you know, how these models were all going to work together and be able to explain how the DEM was derived. And now it's like, we actually want you in the space of using the information level, combining it with a whole other piece of information. And then it just proliferates.
And that whole element of decision making, I think, is so central to why a lot of people are coming to this field right now, to our respective fields of geography and data analysis and education and citizen and community science. And as we start to have people trickling in to join us here for your plenary session, Joseph, I'm going to actually start to move towards a welcome here. We have people joining in both through CitSciVirtual and with us on YouTube. So I do want to go ahead and give you a formal welcome to Dr. Joseph Kerski, who's joining us for our plenary session today. And there will be a more formal introduction to Joseph and his talk momentarily. But first, let me say welcome to all of you who are joining us on these two platforms. I'm Jennifer Shirk. I'm the director of the Citizen Science Association, and thank you for joining us. If you're joining us on YouTube, glad to have you here. If you're joining us through CitSciVirtual, welcome back to week 2 of this event, and I am so thrilled to be kicking it off with this great talk about so many things: data analysis, data aggregation, storytelling through data, how we learn and how we access these many different tools and resources for learning and thinking together critically about the science that we can do together. Before we kick off, I do want to give a quick and huge thank you to all of the volunteer planners and organizers who have dedicated their time to pulling this event together for us. And today I'll give a shout out in particular to our keynote committee and the work that they have done to bring these excellent speakers to your attention and then to engage you during this event with them. If you're joining us through CitSciVirtual, you have opportunity to be sharing your questions through the Q&A tools and also on CitSciVirtual. And Pam DeBona, one of the co-chairs of that committee, is with us behind the scenes here and will be helping to weave your questions in. I want to give a quick welcome and thank you to Calvin Cupini, who's a CSA board member, and will be introducing our keynote speaker momentarily, as well as Mary Ford, who is at National Geographic and is one of the co-chairs of CSA's education working group, and will be joining at the end of this for the Q&A session with Dr. Kerski. But before we turn to him, one last huge thank you, and that is to Esri, who has been supporting CitSciVirtual for all of you who are attending throughout this month and who are continuing to support innovation in data analysis and storytelling and data aggregation, and helping to bring these innovations to the fields of citizen and community science. And we're really grateful to be learning with and together with them throughout this month. So make sure to check out the resources and the sessions that they have to offer. So again, thank you. I'm excited to have Dr. Kerski here, and let's go ahead and get this event started.
Welcome to CitSciVirtual. A few reminders. You can see us, but we can't see you. If you are joining us in the Zoom event, you are welcome to ask questions to our presenter by using the Q&A tool. If you would like to chat with attendees on this topic, please go to today's event in the CitSciVirtual group in CSA Connect and make comments there. The presentation has been recorded in advance to reduce technical glitches. Please enjoy the presentation and stay with us for the live Q&A later in the event. Now let's get started. And to kick us off is Citizen Science Association board member Calvin Cupini.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to CitSciVirtual. My name is Calvin Cupini. I'm on the board of directors of the Citizen Science Association, and I get to introduce today's plenary: mapping, analyzing, and communicating citizen science information using field tools, web GIS, dashboards, and story maps. Personal side note, I would like to mention that I'm a big fan of story maps and have used them to display geographic information about my citizen science projects in Charlotte, North Carolina, which means I'm extremely excited to hear from Joseph Kerski, an education manager at Esri, a GIS professional. Today's web-enabled geographic information systems tools, open data portals, and real-time IoT feeds can be powerfully and easily joined with citizen science collection tools and data from meaningful investigations and interactive, shareable multimedia maps. Join geographer Joseph Kerski as we explore why and how these tools can be used by educators, students, researchers, and others to analyze data from the local to global scale to build a more resilient and sustainable future. That's fantastic, Joseph. Take it away.
Greetings all. Joseph Kerski here with you to talk about mapping, analyzing, and communicating citizen science. How do we do that? Through geo-visualizations, through mapping technologies, geographic information systems, location analytics. And the goal is to understand what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? What's where, why is it there, and why should we care? In other words, the whys of where. Not just where things are, but why things are where they are. Why do certain aspects of our world have a spatial pattern, relationships, and trends? And how can we understand them and then build a more resilient, safer, healthier, happier, more sustainable world? That is the whole goal of this presentation. Really glad that you're here with me today at the Citizen Science Association Conference. Thrilled to be with all of you. Let's begin with an actual hands-on citizen science activity. And I'm going to use an aspect of this Geographic Information Systems platform. This particular one's called ArcGIS. And one piece of that, and we'll talk about other pieces here in the presentation, is called Survey 123. So if I open this survey that I have placed in the discussion board for the conference, you'll be able to access this same survey. And I'm asking some simple questions. What's your role? K-12 educator, higher education, non-education, etc. How much have you used interactive mapping tools? Now, we haven't discussed all of the aspects of interactive mapping tools, but I'd just like you to, okay, interactive mapping tools. Okay, I've used it a bit, or much, or extensively, or not much. And then, germane to our discussion about location today, where are you located? So you can use this little map and find your town, your city. And then, where would you most like to conduct citizen science work next in terms of continents? And then I have another choice at the end, as you can see there, on another planet or a moon. So think big here. So those are the questions that I have in this survey. This survey was created in Survey 123, which is part of the ArcGIS platform that my organization
hosts and has created. The results of this survey are going to look a bit different when you're actually watching this. When you're actually watching this, you're going to see real-time feeds from your locations. Right now, I'm already seeing some people have submitted some data points where you've got a spatial pattern occurring right here. This is a dashboard. It's a dashboard that is a part of that same ArcGIS platform that Survey 123 was. Survey 123, it is a tool much like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms that you probably have used in the past. But in this case, the added benefit, the added advantage is that you can map things and understand things better in a more deeper, richer way. Why do I say and? Because oftentimes as a geographer, people will send me their maps as URL links and say, hey, Joseph, I've mapped my data on invasive species or water quality or public art in my town or historical homes or something else. And I'll say, great. And why do I say and? Because folks, mapping is only a stepping stone to a larger goal. The larger goal is to understand things in a deeper, richer way so that we can lead to action, that these things are actionable, that, okay, now that I understand the location and the spatial patterns of invasive species or the water quality or some other variable in my own study area or my community, I want to do something about it. I want to do something about invasive species or urban greenways or public art or whatever it is. So the mapping, the geotechnologies that we'll talk about today are important to be sure. For two reasons, folks. First of all, maps are representations of reality. They're not reality. First of all, we're living on an oblate spheroid. It's not a perfect sphere. It's wider around the equator than it is around the poles. So we have to represent that oblate spheroid as 2D or 3D web maps. So right from the get-go, maps are representations of reality. They're very useful representations of reality, but they are representations nonetheless. They also have imperfections and distortions that we'll talk about later today. But for right now, first of all, maps are representations of reality. Secondly, the idea of using maps as a stepping stone to understanding an issue or a problem in a deeper, richer way comes to the following statement, and that is, it's good to know some of these geotechnology tools. They are enabling us to see the world in a different way, to understand our world in different ways, in richer, deeper ways. But that is not the end point. The end point, remember, is not to get your data on the map, even though we're going to talk a lot about mapping technologies today. Remember, there's a bigger, more noble, higher goal, and that is, again, to build a sustainable, resilient, healthier, happier world. So right here, I've got Survey 123. And as I mentioned, it's much like Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, where you're dragging things over from a form that you want true and false, multiple choice, Likert scale, whatever. But the advantage here is that you can instantly map it. So in this case, I've got your points that you've told me about, and each one of these is tied to a geodatabase. It's a feature service, meaning that you can map it and then understand it by looking at the attributes, like in this case, your role, your where would you most like to conduct citizen science next, etc. And so they are not just points, lines, and polygons floating around in cyberspace. They're actually tied to a powerful geodatabase that we can ask questions of. And in this case, I've got a dashboard with the live interactive web map in here, as well as a couple of elements that came from the survey. So for example, how much have you used interactive mapping tools? I'm seeing the live feeds that are coming in from your responses to the Survey 123. Where would you most like to conduct citizen science? Oh, wow, a couple people have said on another planet or a moon. How many surveys have been filled out, etc. This dashboard is a configurable template that took me literally 15 minutes to build. So we're not talking weeks, months of constructing these things. No coding required. So just like the other tools that we'll talk about, story maps, ArcGIS online maps, you'll be able to build these. I want to empower you to say, gosh, that's really compelling. I want to do that now in my own citizen science project. That's exactly what I want to give you confidence and tools that you can actually do this. So you've all seen JHU coronavirus dashboard. That is, unfortunately, but for good reason, the most popular dashboard that's ever been created and hosted. That's using our same technology. That's using the dashboard technology inside ArcGIS Online. My dashboard that I just showed is the same tools. Now, the JHU coronavirus dashboard was getting feeds from Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization and other feeds. My dashboard is only getting feeds from one source, and that is the survey that you all are filling out, which is much appreciated, because now we can see that, oh, well, I can conduct a survey, I can host a survey, and I can map, and then remember, not just map, but understand something in a deeper, richer way using these geotechnology tools. So the above activity, as I just talked about, represents 4 items in this ArcGIS platform: survey, map, dashboard, and story map. Let me show you another example of what I mean here, and that is as follows. I'm going to go to my walkability story map. This is an issue that I, as a geographer, am very passionate about: walkable neighborhoods. So on my work travels, I make it a point to always get out there on the landscape and walk the community or the campus or wherever I happen to be for work travel. Is this community walkable or not? How would you rate it? Okay, there are some vehicles, but there's not much traffic, so that's good. There's some ramps going to the sidewalk. So if I'm in a wheelchair, for example, I could get up and down those curbs. The pavement the sidewalk is in fairly good condition. So I might list this as admittedly subjectively, but a little bit toward the walkable rather than non-walkable community. So in my story map, I've got a little bit about walkability. What is it? Why does communities care about it, etc. Inside my walkability story map, I have no surprise, survey 1, 2, 3, exactly like you were just using a moment ago. In this particular one, I've got 5 questions. Is this pedestrian friendly or unfriendly in your view? Rate the walkability from horrible to excellent. Tick all the choices that describe it: branches, tree species on the pavement, wide path or sidewalk, dangerous intersection, whatever it is. Where is it? Which is, of course, central to our discussion today. And do you have a photograph of it? And so then in my walkability story map, I have an interactive map with the results of the walkability survey. So in this case, good for pedestrians, pedestrian friendly. Other info, good for kangaroos too. So here's my photograph. It's actually a point that I actually took in response to my own survey. It was good for me as a pedestrian, but it was also good for the kangaroos. Good on you, mate. So that is part of my story map. And at the end, as you probably would suspect, I have a dashboard, just like the dashboard we looked at a moment ago. In this case, it's the dashboard that comes from my walkability survey. So it's, again, a couple of pie charts, a legend, a key, a photograph, a live interactive web map where I can interact with the data. And as of this moment, there are 476 survey points that have come in for my walkability survey. I set up this walkability survey and I've made it public. In other words, I've made it crowdsourceable or citizen science enabled. You can do the same thing too with Survey 1, 2, 3. That's the advantage of many of these tools. Many of them are crowdsourceable. The end person doesn't need to know anything about geotechnologies or being in my ArcGIS Online organizational account. They don't need to know anything about that. All they need to do is have the link and they can fill out the walkability survey. But more importantly, I want people to think about, well, what about other things that I could create something similar to what Joseph was showing us at the Citizen Science Association conference about walkability, or about a simple survey of the attendees of the conference, et cetera. Again, these same tools you could create and use. You probably have access to all these tools that I'm talking about right now. And if not, you know where to get a hold of me, and I will give you some links later on in the session here. But this story map, the survey, the online web map in ArcGIS Online in this case, and the dashboard, each one of those components took me about an hour. So in a span of one afternoon, I created this whole thing. So we're not talking, again, days, weeks, months. Now, some of you might say, well, Joseph, gosh, I remember GIS. I had GIS in college as an undergraduate, or I had GIS as a grad student, and it was clunky, and it was difficult to use, and it was a big steep learning curve, and I had big manuals of procedures and workflows. Okay, admittedly, GIS, geotechnologies, location analytics, at one point in time was all of those things. It is much more accessible in large part now because we have this cloud-enabled system. Now, this is revolutionary for several reasons. First of all, you all have music on your own devices, right? And you, most of all, though, more importantly, and more commonly, you have music that's up in this cloud-based environment, right? You have Amazon Music, you've got Apple Music, you've got Spotify, Pandora, music services. You don't really care what server they're on as long as you can access ABBA's greatest hits. That was a band, by the way. But the point is, it's online, okay? And you want to be able to access it with multiple devices anytime, anywhere. Same thing with Google Docs or OneDrive or Dropbox or any of those tools where you're interacting with maybe colleagues on a paper and you want to have a shared space for all the chapters or all the components in your paper. You put it up there so you can collaborate on it, right? And that's wonderful, right? You don't have to have everything local. And I just submit to you all that having geotechnologies in this cloud-based environment is important for citizen science and beyond for several reasons. One, the issues and problems that we face on our planet, water quality and quantity, energy, natural hazards, land use, social and racial inequities, climate. I mean, these are complex issues that increasingly affect our everyday lives. Also, they require multiple people from multiple disciplines to help grapple and solve, right? We don't want to just have the land use managers or the economists or the city planners or the natural resources analysts and the data scientists. We need all those people and more. So it's a discipline busting, if you will, a discipline breaking down the walls kind of paradigm shift, having GIS in the cloud, because we want to collaborate on solving these perplexing, complex problems. And the second thing is, as you see behind me, this ridgetop, these problems don't stop at physical boundaries. They don't stop at watershed boundaries or ecological region boundaries, right? They transcend all those boundaries. And thirdly, they don't stop at political boundaries. They're not just your city, your town, my town, your region, your state, your country. They're global. So they transcend all of those boundaries, and hence having geotechnologies in the cloud with data as services, software as a service, having the models being able to be shared, so you don't have to replicate exactly the land use model that I'm using, et cetera, is absolutely revolutionary. So going back to your experience with GIS in the past, I would say that was then and this is now. We have arrived at a system where it is becoming the language of the planet. You know, one could argue that there are certain other things in society that qualify, maybe music as one of them, but maps becoming the language of the planet. I'm oftentimes reminded of a video that I showed to my introductory GIS students for many years, and it was called A World in a Box. And it had the logging community, the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest and the USA with the environmental community. And the first 20 minutes of that video is very, it definitely drew the students in because it was very compelling, people throwing themselves in front of logging trucks and so on. And the amazing part of that video was once they got GIS, okay, they weren't, sitting around with guitars and hugging each other, but the point was they could all then realize that they had one goal in common. They had one common goal, and that was a healthy forest. And so at least they could start talking around these maps and these databases. Again, sure, they had some issues to solve still, but at least they could come together and start a dialogue and not coming to blows, if you know what I mean. So the point is that maps are becoming this language of the planet where people realize that so many of these problems are spatial in nature, and we need to empower people to be change agents. That's exactly what we need to do. The second thing I wanted to mention about that is that much like the nervous system in your body, maps and geospatial technology are becoming this sort of nervous system of the planet, where you've got IoT feeds that are geo-enabled, for example, from stream gauging stations, wildfire perimeters, energy output from wind turbines, etc. Real-time weather feeds. People want the information now or as near real-time as possible, and they can map it and analyze it in real time because we have this cloud-based system. It was not possible in our desktop systems of the past. It was always locked up into individual people's computers or workstations. We were confined by the CPU and the graphics cards, and how do we share data with people, or their satellite images and their 3D web maps, and how do we do that? And now, I'm not going to say that it's all push one button and all your problems are solved, but we are much more enabled to grapple with these problems with these web-based geographic information systems technology. So if you haven't looked at GIS in a while, I would just encourage you to do so. And also for citizen science, I've just touched on a couple of things so far, but more to come. Okay, more to come in the next 3 hours. Just kidding, we don't have 3 hours, but we're living in amazing times. But we've never been before so empowered by these tools, but yet we're still challenged. And that's one of the reasons why I get excited about the possibility and the reality. Really, there's some case studies that I'll show you on people doing real work with citizen science and geotechnologies. I would also just submit to you all that we've got these forces acting that are positioning us to think about how spatial thinking on the world stage is becoming enabled. First of all, I want to make sure that you knew where I was coming from on all this. I think it's wonderful if students understand how to geocode and how to buffer a river to make a riparian zone, and how to geocode a bunch of addresses and georegister historical aerial photos or satellite images to get them in the same map projection so we can analyze change over space and time. That's all good, but remember, it's a means to a greater goal. Spatial thinking is one of the greater goals. Empowering students and others to think spatially and critically about their world. To me, that's one of the noble goals. And again, geotechnologies helps us to do that. And that's the kind of students that we'll need as graduates in the workplace in the future. So for those of you that are involved with education, I salute you all. For those of you that are not involved with education, there's still ways that you can incorporate geotechnologies with your colleagues, your coworkers, et cetera, with citizen science, as we'll talk about. But geo-awareness is at an all-time high, at least in my career. I've never before witnessed so many people, not just the geo-enviro citizen science community, but others talking about, again, these issues of climate and resilience and oceans and so on. The awareness is at an all-time high. They don't always connect it to the things that we're talking about at the conference, but at least they're aware that these are serious issues that we need to do something about. And secondly, geo-enablement. People, at least now, the key example of course, is the JHU coronavirus dashboard that's using the dashboard and the ArcGIS online, the Internet of Things, geo-enabled feeds, and so on. And also just finding your way across campus or to your grandmother's house or whatever with web mapping tools. People do that, and they're comfortable doing that nowadays. And the geotechnologies themselves having elevated or advanced into this cloud-based mode, again, is a very much of a paradigm shifting moment for all of us. Citizen science is a key part of this because we have tools and the ability to quickly and powerfully enable people to collect data, again, on water quality, birds, invasive species, et cetera. Map it, analyze it, make decisions about it. And finally, storytelling. This whole presentation of mine, as you probably suspect, is a story map. Some of you have used story maps. Story maps have been around for about 10 years. They enable you to tell a story through maps, graphics, audio, video, et cetera. But the key word in there is mapped data. So sure, I still use Prezi, I still use PowerPoint, I still use Microsoft Sway, but increasingly I use story maps to communicate. And so do many people, from government to nonprofit to academia, primary and secondary education. Now, why should you listen to Joseph? Well, I'm not the end-all be-all authority on this. My pathway, though, that I wanted to share ever so briefly was I have toes in 4 different sectors of society. So nonprofit, I was president of the National Council for Geographic Education, and I'm active in other nonprofit, Society for Conservation GIS, that I think many of you should know about. If you don't know about it, scgis.org. I've had a history in federal agencies, so I worked for NOAA, USGS, Census Bureau. So I love spatial data. So I created spatial data. I've worked with data users for many decades. And like many of you listening to this, I love teaching. I love getting students and others excited about the power of geotechnologies. And I'm in private industry also. So I work for ESRI, the Environmental Systems Research Institute. ESRI is an organization that creates spatial data, geotechnologies, methods, workflows, and a community where people can be empowered to make smarter and wiser decisions. So this is the kind of maps that I made when I was a teenager. I'll just be on a personal note here and share this with you. They were on big poster boards, and I've got, as you can see here, bridges and railroads and city parks and piers, and I named all the streets and so on. I guess things haven't changed that much because I still love maps, and here I am laying on a big map of my homeland here in Colorado with my right arm pointing at the location where I am right now. Space is a fundamental part of our human experience. And so that's another thing that ties us to these geotechnologies is, maps have been used to tell stories for thousands of years, right? Clay tablets, wood blocks, Al-Idrisi's map on silver in the 11th century. onto film 100 years ago, copper plates, film, and now in the digital world. So maps have always been used to tell deep stories, powerful stories, sometimes controversial stories, and they still do today. They are very engaging, a lot of information in a short amount of space. And our threefold mission at Esri, just to as a little background about where I'm coming from, has always been education, sustainability, and science. And for you students thinking about where can I work in the future, please consider us and also our business partners. We want students like you, graduates like you that think spatially, think critically, work with data, like get outside, like to ask questions about the world, but also love working with technology in meaningful ways, meaningful technology to make a positive difference. And this really is fundamental to our whole being. So many of you know this, but we've got the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. They're our founders of Esri, and they donated this big chunk of this elbow of California to the Nature Conservancy so that it would be protected and it could be studied and enjoyed for centuries to come. So this whole idea of a private company doing mighty good, and we're very proud to be a sponsor of the Citizen Science Association. We really believe in this stuff. I was telling our organizers that many of us would find a way to be in this space, geotechnologies, even if we weren't getting paid doing it. It's just a really important part of us, and we really believe in this stuff, folks. So please consider us as your partner in industry and also education going forward. I'm on the education team supporting schools, universities, tribal colleges, technical colleges, community colleges. Another thing to bring up here is that maps have become the language of science. It's being used rigorously in biology, in oceanography, in volcanology, etc. Not just, again, where things are, but maps as analytical tools. So part of my role as on the education team is to get people thinking about not just where things are, but what patterns, relationships, and trends do these geographic phenomena have that you're mapping and analyzing. So not just maps as locations and showing locations, but maps as analytical tools. And also engaging people in citizen science. Citizen science goes way back to the 19th century in many areas of society, as we all know. But the idea of now I can collect that data that I was collecting, but now instantly map it and be able to do something about it based on the patterns that I see. And enabling spatial analysis of citizen science data. We've got our own Esri Press with a lot of these books and in ebook format, for example, that you can take a look at in further detail. Maybe we can chat about that after the session ends. Let me just illustrate what I mean by modern software as a solutions-based GIS and why it matters. So for example, let's say within 30 seconds, I can pull up this map of demographic characteristics, for example, of the USA. And inside here, I can say, you know what? I want to symbolize the map in a different way than I'm doing right now. So if I choose an attribute in this one single map layer, which is being fed from the American Community Survey, the US Census Bureau, I've got all kinds of information in here. What if I looked at something like the median age? Okay, let's look at the median age. So if I add the median age, I'm going to get a bunch of symbols, but I can override the default symbol set. I want color, and I'm going to say, okay, I want color, median age, interesting. Okay, and I'm going to pick, I'm just going to go with the defaults. Time doesn't permit me to go further than that. But now as I zoom in, I know many of you are out here in the West, I'm going to zoom into the block group level. And as I zoom into the block group level, I'm going to see patterns, relationships, trends. I'm going to zoom into the Central Valley of California here now, and I'm going to go down to the block group level. I'm at the census tract level, and as I go into the neighborhood level, I'm going to see what I mapped when I was looking at these block groups earlier. So I'm going to just pan over here for a moment and then go into this community here, block group level. And remember, the darker colors, let's just take a look at the legend, shall we? The darker colors are older median age. Wouldn't it be great if I could change the base map and say something like terrain with labels? And that way I get a little bit of a context as to where these block groups are. Okay, so in this particular community, Manteca, California, I've got a neighborhood up here where the median age is a bit older. I've got some neighborhoods in the central part of town and out west where it's younger. So again, what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? Why should we care if the median age is different? Okay, what if I'm planning a certain kind of service in my community? I might want to, maybe it's a service for the senior population. Maybe I want to look at the neighborhoods where the median age is a bit older, or if I'm planning childcare services, right? I'm going to maybe zero in on and plan that service for those neighborhoods. And ditto for lots of other variables that we could map and analyze. Within a few seconds, I've got some data at my fingertips. I've got analytical tools. I've got data as services streaming in, and I'm using ArcGIS Online for my main mapping platform. Again, online, no software required, runs on any device, etc. But the second thing I wanted to point out here is not only is it easy to make one of these maps and then share it, turn it into a story map, show it to your constituents, your partners, your clients, your patrons, whoever. The second thing I wanted to point out here is I want people to be critical of the data. Don't just accept it because it's on the web. Don't just accept it because it's a web map. Understand the sources, understand who created it, when was it created, how often is it updated, all of that sort of metadata that's associated with each one of these map layers. Because maps are so commonplace now, it's no longer just the USGSs of the world and the Ordnance Surveys and the World Health Organization. You and I, anybody, everybody is a map creator nowadays, not just a map consumer. And that being said, this platform, ArcGIS Online, is an open platform. Anybody can create data into it. That being said, though, because of that, you've got this wide spectrum of data quality in there, right? And that's a good thing, but also it's wise to understand, again, is that map suitable for my use? And to understand that, you need to dig into these metadata components in these map layers. Two things related to that then. First of all, I have a spatial reserves data blog. I know a data blog sounds really boring, but this is really important. It came from a book that a colleague and I wrote called The GIS Guide to Public Domain Data. And every week we update this spatial reserves data blog with location privacy. How do I know where to find data? How do I know if it's any good? What about societal issues like copyright and, again, location privacy and other things, ethics and so on that are around data? Because it's never just about the technology, right, folks? It's always about the societal implications of the technology we use, which is one of the reasons why I love working with the citizen science community. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to mention about easy to make these maps, but be critical of the data. Don't just accept it because it's a web map. These maps may look authoritative, but they all have challenges, and use them wisely. Use them. Don't be overcautious, but use them in the context that they're meant to be used. The second thing I wanted to mention is that inside this platform called ArcGIS Online, we have a subset of data called the Living Atlas of the World. The Living Atlas is about 8,500 layers. Authoritative data sources, again, not perfect, but the NOAA, the NASA, the WHO, the CDC, your state Department of Natural Resources, et cetera. They place data in the Living Atlas. And again, it's not to be considered the end-all perfect source, but it is a good starting point for if you need to find spatial data on ecoregions, watersheds, land cover, land use, et cetera, water quality, and so on, that I know are important to all of us. Coming back to this discussion then, let's take a look at some concrete ways that we can use citizen science with mapping and geotechnologies. One of the ways is, and I think a good manifestation of this whole advent to the web, to the cloud, is this. I love this. I wish I could get excited about this. This is amazing. I mean, think of past scientists of centuries ago. If they had this sort of, they'd just be like, wow, this is incredible. And modern folks like us, right? It's like, wow, this is incredible. But the Living Atlas indicators of the planet, I mentioned the Living Atlas of the world, and this is a piece of the Living Atlas. But you've got this set of tiles, many of which are tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And let's say we took a issue of, okay, I want to look at cyclones. Why is that important? How is it important? How does it affect X, Y, and Z on our planet? So inside each one of these, you've got a live interactive web map with some data in it, and you have story maps and other things where you can learn about more about that issue. And the same thing goes with these other indicators of the planet. So let's say you're an educator and you want to show this at the beginning of every week to your students. Okay, students, pick an indicator and be prepared and do some research. Be prepared to talk about using these interactive tools as your presentation mode, why this matters, and how it affects our region, where we are right now in our university, for example. There are several advantages, I believe, to this whole idea of geo-citizen-science instruction. Here are a few of them. I'm not going to detail all of these for you, but having students understand how to use data is going to be important in whatever field they're going into, right? Transportation, social work, human health, you name it, right? Working with data. Also systems thinking about the hydrosphere, interacting with the lithosphere, the biosphere, the anthrosphere, the human sphere, and so on. Having that systems thinking. That's what I love about geotechnologies. It's always been a systems thinking and a thinker's tool. In other words, again, the idea is solving problems with these. So it's problem-based learning, which is near and dear to many educators' hearts. It also involves students in working outside and some of the things that you and I love about citizen science, to be honest. Establishing connections with the community, getting students interested in whatever age they are about real issues in their community. I truly believe that these geotechnologies are essential for learning, but also essential for the planet. And they're evolving. So I mentioned the whole cloud-based interoperability, accessibility, components, qualities of, if you will, of geotechnologies, that you can share these and not just make these maps, but then share them as story maps, as dashboards, as infographics, et cetera, to the wider community. Or there are compelling reasons not to share, right? You're working with some sensitive data on various issues. I work with a lot, for example, in my case, I'm working with a lot of tribal governments. I'm also a caver. There's a National Cave Protection Act, right? You don't just put a public-facing map of all cave locations with latitude and longitudes, right? So there's lots of reasons not to share the information as well. So that's something to keep in mind, but many reasons to share certain types of information to empower people to make wiser decisions. Also tied to societal issues. So students make these story maps like this one on ArcGIS and Citizen Science. This is a story map that I invite you to take a look at, looking at the whole process of collecting, monitoring, analyzing, and then communicating. And also, again, oftentimes taking action on the macroinvertebrates or whatever they're gathering here in this wetland. Another thing that I wanted to share here was that GIS has moved from this system of records. Think of your city government, every fire hydrant, every light pole, and oftentimes every tree in every public park in your community. That was the bulk of GIS work for a long time, gathering the data into a big interlocking set of geodatabases. And now that much of that data has been gathered, certainly not all of it, but now the challenge is, how do we build resiliency and sustainability in communities with the geotechnologies and the data that we have at our fingertips? So it's much more of a system of engagement. One of the ways that communities are doing that is setting up these ArcGIS hubs that probably many of you have seen. As people set up these ArcGIS hubs, they are serving data. So it's a part of the open data movement, and they are communicating with their citizens. So for example, my own community has and yours might have as well, a crowdsourced citizen science app where I can report conditions on trails. Again, remember, walkability and bikeability is very important to me. So I actually used this, true story, in the fall of 2020 when we were all working at home. I still am. But the point is, I was out there cycling. There's a couple of places that I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great if someone could actually fix this? Because this is really rough on a bicycle. So I used that tool to report it to my community. The community actually came out 2 days later and marked it. And then 2 days after that, actually repaired it. So I thought, like, wow, this is incredible. And what if this was replicated thousands of times over? It not only empowers citizens to be involved in their community issues, but it also helps the community to know what the citizens are interested in, right? And allocate resources effectively. Here's an example of what we could do with geospatial technology in the not too distant past versus what we can do with it today. So modeling seagrass, seagrasses are important. to many ecosystems, estuarine, oceans, the coastlines, and so on. This is the kind of thing that we could do in the past. We'd make these maps that kind of looked like this, where we would look at predicted and observed seagrass distribution. Nothing wrong with that, but nowadays what we can do is we can do things like creating hexagons or hex bins for that data and run it through spatial statistics algorithms to come up with better models, and then of course communicate why this actually matters. Nothing wrong with communicating in traditional means. I write articles and chapters, you probably write articles and chapters, and you're getting, that audience involved, to be certain. But now you also have these abilities to create story maps and dashboards and infographics where you're getting a much wider and more diverse audience involved with what you really care about. So again, not neglecting traditional means of communication, but being able to do this in these citizen science, crowd-sourced, web GIS enabled modes, I think is really important. Here's another example, and that is to show what we could do in the past versus what we can do now with geotechnology. So traffic accidents, okay, an important issue, right? Probably has affected your family. I know it's affected mine. It's a personal issue, but it's also a global issue, right? In the past, we could analyze data and we would make a map like this, for example, in ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Pro, and we would look at, okay, we can symbolize these based on time of day of the week, whether pedestrians were involved, whether there was impairment involved, etc. Okay, nothing wrong with that, but that's what we could do at the time. We were basically replicating what we do with paper maps and traditional mapping methods in a digital mode. But now we've gone beyond that. We're actually looking at things in new ways, again, with these hexagons in 2D, but also looking at them, let's say I've got, like all projects, a certain constraint on my project. I have a certain number of staff, I have a certain budget, deadlines. I only have a certain amount of resources. So I'm going to look at the clusters that are consecutive hotspots, significantly higher accidents, and I'm going to focus on those in this particular community, as you can see in coastal Florida. Those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. So again, a couple of things. We're mapping things in new ways for new understanding. And secondly, we're making the best decisions possible given we're always going to have constraints, right, folks? And so that's where I think the empowerment issue comes in. Another thing, if we had time, I would show you other citizen science applications where citizens are reporting the situation where there was a near miss at this, because this is just confirmed accidents. What about all the near misses that have occurred and concerns that maybe pedestrians have or even commuters have in their community about certain potentially hazardous accident-prone areas? So that's another thing that I just wanted to show you all here, new ways of mapping and understanding. It's also, this whole idea of web-based GIS is becoming more and more connected to artificial intelligence, big data, and the Internet of Things. So consider this scene. If you have a standard city vehicle going down the street, taking images with just a dash cam, a dashboard cam, what we have now is the ability to capture every single feature, living and non-living, that video captures, for example, and identifying it. Light pole, tree species, tree condition of the curb, last time this was repaired, sign, etc. You get the idea. Every single thing that you can see in that image, you can capture automatically now. So that's transforming a lot of the GIS workflows and jobs actually that people have had traditionally, was collecting the data. Now that we've got the data, what are we going to do with it? How do we make our cities better places to live? Another thing that I wanted to do is, let's get practical here. How can you embrace these tools, Joseph? I kind of get the idea now that I've got these tools at my fingertips: surveys, dashboards, infographics, web maps. Well, how do I do that? How do I actually make that happen, for example, in my instruction, in my after-school program, in my informal museums, libraries, wherever I'm working with colleagues, with my colleagues' kids, or in my own instruction in my tribal college, my technical college, my university, my community college, or in my primary or secondary school? Well, these are just a couple of examples. And again, I encourage you to look at my story map for some more information, but I would say use existing activities that are tied to these interactive web maps. You don't have to create your own lessons for all this. We've got plenty of lessons that you can actually dip into to learn more about GIS and also to teach with geotechnologies. and then dig deeper into data tied to existing lessons. Create your own activities. That's still an option. Gather, map, and analyze data in your own community, and then create and give oral and written presentations with story maps. Using lots of different instructional models. One projector, bunch of students, multiple devices, bring your own devices, a dedicated lab, online instruction. And it is, if the health crisis hadn't happened in the era of WebGIS, we really would have been struggling, to be honest, in how to actually teach with these tools in the old desktop only days. In many cases, it wouldn't have been able to be possible because it was tied to a physical lab. And now many instructors have decided, hey, I can do this in a virtual environment, a hybrid environment, or in a face-to-face environment. And what I'm advocating here, folks, just stepping back for a moment, is that it's never really just teaching with geotechnologies or a teaching about geotechnologies. It's always a merging of the two. So for example, if you're teaching about ecoregions or invasive species, you're using the geotechnologies to analyze and understand those at multiple scales. Conversely, if you're teaching sort of in a GIS program, you're still using some real world data, earthquakes or tropical storms or public art in your community or whatever it is. You're still using real data to teach about those techie tools. And overarching, and the third leg of the stool, if you will, is this geographic perspective. You don't have to be a geographer to have a geographic perspective. It's a spatial perspective looking at changes over space and time. So again, getting a little bit more practical in our closing moments here is help students think critically about data, including spatial data. I've already brought up the Spatial Reserves data book and blog. One of my entries in there is, take a look at this satellite image. What's wrong with this picture? It's not exactly how you would see it, the Earth, if you were peering over the aircraft or the satellite that is orbiting the Earth, right? Because, for example, in this lower right image, the right-hand image, there's no traffic. So the image has been manipulated, not necessarily for nefarious reasons, but because maybe the DOT wanted no traffic on there. So they've removed all the moving vehicles so they could get a condition of the roadways, or maybe using it in planning a HOV lane or a light rail or something like that. So images also need to be looked at critically. Offsets, there are offsets in images. And that's another thing you need to be aware of as you teach with these. We have a variety of wonderful web mapping applications. One of them is called the Ecological Marine Units Explorer. This is just one of literally dozens of these, folks, and I wish we'd had more time together, but I just encourage you to take a look at these. This is an amazing, 3 years in the making. We've got, you have, I have, we all have at our fingertips this incredible set of data where we have, oh my goodness gracious, look at this. You've got 10-kilometer spacing around the world with multiple chemical variables, dissolved oxygen, etc., and the temperature gradient. So you could use this from primary school all the way to university level and beyond, teaching students that, yeah, the ocean is not just this green or blue expanse as you see on many maps, right? Oceans have lots of variability. And how do we understand oceans? One of the ways is through this Ecological Marine Units Explorer. And this is just, as you can see in the upper left, it is inside ArcGIS Online. It is a web map. You can combine it with other layers. You can combine it with population densities. How many people actually live close to coasts and so on. So that's one tool that I wanted to show you. Another one is the Wayback imagery. So let's say, again, taking that theme of change over space and time, let's look at how communities have changed because of, in this case, let's grab the swipe tool, urbanization. So lots of changes here. Or what about surface water and climate over time? So here we are in Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. I'm looking at, wow, between 2014 and 2021, the lake level has declined. Lake Mead, a reservoir actually. Why? Okay, so let's look at the factors. Why should we care? Okay, if we've got cities out in the semi-arid or arid areas, or even other cities in more humid areas, water is a fundamental UN Sustainable Development Goal, right? Water quality and quantity. How are we going to build resiliency for these communities that are affected by this situation? You can use the same tool to look at glacial retreat, coastal erosion, agricultural expansion, deforestation, reforestation, all kinds of things. You've got terabyte loads of satellite imagery at your fingertips at multiple years. This is just amazing. Okay, couple more things. Use the tools in combination. They are all part of this web GIS, ArcGIS platform. The survey, the story map, the operations dashboard that I showed earlier, the walkability example that I showed at the beginning of this session. And I would just submit to you all that the evolution of citizen science, geotechnologies, and our planet can and should change instructional practice. Folks, don't get me started about this, but I think the days of us asking students to memorize big blocks of content and then regurgitate it for the test and then erase that part of your brain. I mean, we've all been there, right? We've all had that experience at some point in our educational career. I'm not saying that some content knowledge is not important. And again, you can look things up, be critical of the things that you look up and understand the sources and so on. But I really want students to be engaged in community issues. And that's why I love working with you all in the citizen science community. There's no shortage of resources to find out more about this. And you might say, well, do you have a lesson on X using citizen science and these wonderful, data sets and web GIS technologies? Probably. We probably do. We may not, though. And that's okay if there's not, because you could take any one of these data sets or layers that I've showed, or even more in the Living Atlas of the World, and you could teach concepts and skills around them. You don't actually have to have a predefined lesson for every single one of those. It's kind of like back in my USGS days when I'd get out that big map called This Dynamic Planet. And it's got the earthquakes, the volcanoes, and the rate of plate movement at the plate boundaries. Any educator could take that and say, I'm going to teach about plate tectonics right now, or the dynamic planet that we have on the Earth. And they could take that map and they've taught with it, lay it on a big piece of paper or a big table and teach with it. You can do the same thing with these tools. What's the best tool to use? Here's an actual photograph that I took in an actual high school where I was running a geotech club after school. It was once a valued part of someone's IT infrastructure, right, folks? What is it now? It's a doorstop. The point is, again, this is the most important tool. The tools will change. The geotechnology will change. It's evolving. ArcGIS Online updates quarterly. How are you going to navigate through this change? Understand, again, think of a higher goal, but don't get too attached to that button has to be the second one from the left in this interface. It might not be in the future. That's okay. That's okay, though. And this whole idea of using geotechnologies or GIS or web mapping or even maps as analytical tools is not new. You probably recognize this as a ArcGIS Online based lesson that I've got that I wrote that's available for you to use, but it's based on the John Snow cholera map of 1854 in London. So taking that data and then using geotechnologies to emulate what John Snow was doing, which was mapping all of unfortunately, the cholera victims and their proximity to the water pumps. So using maps as analytical tools to solve a problem and then say, hey, we need to clean up our water. We need to do something about this. And folks, I truly believe we've got some skilled, energetic people, rich and powerful tools that I've hoped to have demonstrated with you all today. Rich, varied data with these open data platforms, the Internet of Things, data as services. We can solve these vexing, complex problems in our world. I'm confident we can with the data, and especially with the citizen science community engaged and empowered to make wiser and smarter decisions. So I believe that you have a critical role in shaping this future. And again, if I can be of any service, inspiration, ideas, sounding board to you in the future, please look to my team and I. That's what we're here for, and we are very honored to be a part of this community. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Joseph, thank you so much for that presentation. You had a lot to cover, a lot of nerdy details, which I enjoy, but I'm outing myself as a nerd. I'm really glad, though, you covered a wide gamut of different fields that can interact with GIS, different communities that can make use of those tools, and then how those tools are becoming a lot more interactive, which is a lot about what CitSciVirtual is about and a lot more about what the CSA is about in general, is the interaction between different stakeholders. For that, though, I would love to introduce Mary Ford, the Director of Professional Learning at the National Geographic Society, which is awesome, and also a co-chair of the Education Working Group here at CSA. Mary, great to see you. I think you're going to ask some of the questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Calvin. Thank you, Joseph. I loved hearing that, all that great information. We've worked with Esri for a long time at National Geographic, Kindred Spirits, and just worked on a story map this past week for Teacher Appreciation Week. We see more and more teachers using GIS and love to see it. And I especially appreciated that giant map you showed, Joseph, and your brief Australian accent as well. So you are multi-talented. We have gotten some really great questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Please use the Q&A to continue to ask questions. I know a few folks, including Vincent, raised questions around access and equity and reaching disadvantaged communities. I know you shared a great resource in the chat, Joseph, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about that and point folks to those resources.
Absolutely. You know, so many of the issues, including equity and social justice, racial justice, et cetera, are spatial in nature. So what we want to do is not just have case studies and stories, although they can be valuable, of people actually using these tools to make their communities better, safer, et cetera, more aware. But we want to empower people with the actual tools themselves. So besides the Racial Equity Hub site that we created, I want to share a recent essay that I wrote. It's not the end all be all, but it's a way for people to use something called policy maps, which are a subset of ArcGIS Online. So I'd love to get your feedback on that. I'm going to share it in the chat box, but thanks, Mary. And it's great to be working with you all these years. Like you say, we're kindred spirits. We're geographic thinkers. We really believe, we're so passionate about empowering students, citizens, educators, scientists, others to using these tools. And by the way, you probably saw, folks, that I skipped wide swaths of that story map that when I was presenting. And that was because you're the citizen science community, and I wanted to give you some more things that I wouldn't have time to cover in the keynote. So please feel free to do some further digging and maybe touch on some of the things that I skipped. So I'm going to paste that in there right now, Mary. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I know this is a topic that is important to many of us, so I appreciate you giving us follow-up resources. I think Jennifer's posting also about some more opportunities that we'll have to discuss issues around spatial justice and racial justice and intersectionality later in this virtual conference. And I'm so grateful for those opportunities and this conference highlighting those issues. Joseph, another theme that showed up a lot, Liz, Ethan, and others were asking about location privacy concerns. I'm particularly interested in this too, from the point of view of an educator and being on the education working group. We are really careful about protecting the privacy of any children who participate in citizen science. And so I know you have some more comments to make on location privacy too. So what would you like to share on that?
That could be a whole another hour, right, Mary? Good points, and I'm glad people were raising that, because it's never just learning how to buffer, learning how to geocode, learning how to symbolize and classify data. Maps are very powerful, and I want people to be careful about the choice that they make with the colors and the classification methods and the projection and all the rest of it. It all matters, but intertwined with that, it's never just about those tools and about the way you communicate with maps. It's like you're saying, and like people are rightly indicating in the chats and the Q&A, it is a technology. It's a personal, very personal kind of a technology because it affects our everyday movements. I mean, who has a fitness app? Has that impacted your fitness? Has that, I go around the block one more time, I'm going to get 0.2 more miles or kilometers. So it's a personal thing, but it's also a community and a societal issue. So intertwined with that is, like you said, bound up in ethics and privacy. Sometimes we get over enthusiastic folks that say, hey, I've mapped all the locations of my community or my students, for example. And we're like, don't share that. Even though you can, doesn't mean you should. So in the the survey that I had you all filled out at the beginning, I usually do that at the beginning of all my workshops and in my courses as well. And in the courses that I teach, the university courses, in week 2 or 3, I said, remember that survey you filled out in week 1? Did you put that point on your actual house or dwelling or apartment? And if you did, does it really matter? Or did you just put it on your city or your, region? But again, if you put it on your house and there's no name tied to it, and if I just shared it with my organization, or if I didn't share it with anybody, or on the other hand, if I shared it with the whole community, would it matter? There are certain instances where you want to share your location, right? You want your pizza delivered, you want to record your fitness, etc. So I just want people to think about those, and I'm glad I'm glad you and the others brought it up, because as we go forward with some of the new technologies that I ever so briefly touched on, artificial intelligence, machine learning, we're going to need to make some really key decisions about how and where and why we share any sort of personal information about our location. That's very valued, of course, in many sectors of society, right? Where you actually are in the store, for example, is valued by the merchandiser. The key placement of items and where you are in the community and where you shop and interact. So, yeah, it's a very important thing that we get across, I think, at all levels of education. I know you and I are very passionate about all levels. So, beginning with primary school students, there's ways to teach this effectively. And thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's just a reminder that critical thinking is such an important component of all the work that we do. We want our students and our participants to be thinking critically about every action that they take as part of data collection and data analysis and data sharing. And I appreciate that GIS is a tool that helps us do that and helps us promote critical thinking.
And one more thing, Mary, when we work with primary and secondary students, minors under 18, we have all kinds of things in place. And I'll just touch on a few of them. First of all, if you're a school, they have access to all this ArcGIS technology for free as their school site license. And we also have measures in place where it's not the student's name and their personal identification in there. So student 1 at, X middle school, student 2 at X middle school, et cetera. And also, we're a GIS company. We're not an advertising company. We don't care about, hey, there's this cool, cafe down the road that you should go check out, that type of thing. I don't have access to anybody's ArcGIS online organization, for example. That is all maintained by the school. We just help them set up the infrastructure and have the students dig into the data. That's all we really care about is student learning and student engagement.
Okay, Joseph, can you just reiterate that? So any school in the United States, or what's
it's global. It's a global program. Yeah, it came out through the STEM initiative through the White House back in 2012, I believe. So it's about 8 years old. But globally, as long as there's an international ESRI distributor that's behind it, we want to make sure that the teachers and the students have the support organizationally. So in many, many, many countries around the world, it's the same situation. Where the school, if they want to have access to these tools, they can use it. I'd also bring up too that some of the things that I showed are intentionally done so that you don't actually have to sign into anything. All you need is a web browser and a halfway decent internet connection. And we can talk about, the digital divide and digital access and all the issues intertwined with that. Certainly there are challenges, even with university students, right? They all went online, in March of 2020. And we worked with, I'm sure you did as well, lots of students saying, hey, I can no longer swallow this big data set. Okay, how can we reduce the study area, the variables that you're using, and still teach that particular unit effectively now that you're at your home office, basically. But yes, they do have access to it. And the point I'm bringing up right now is that some of the things that you can do with these tools, you don't actually have to sign into anything. If you want to dig deeper, though, and make your own story maps, web mapping applications, do some spatial analysis, then you need a place to park all of that. And then they do need the educator and the students, they do need to have a sign-in to ArcGIS, the platform.
So I know earlier in your talk, some folks were asking about the difference between what you were showing and what you need the desktop version of ArcGIS to access. Could you talk a little bit about what you were doing and how that's available?
Sure, good point. Okay, so ArcGIS Online has data, maps, map layers, feature services, survey 123, story maps, things like that, and also has about 45 analytical tools, which is pretty remarkable that you can actually do, trace downstream. What water flows from this point down, how does it get to the ocean from this, or this area is hazardous for landslides and for floods, and give me an intersection, that classic map overlay kind of operation. There's about 45 analytical tools inside ArcGIS Online. And all of the stuff that I was showing today, with the exception of the hex bin creation for the seagrass, was all done in ArcGIS Online. So 99% of all that was done in ArcGIS Online. But to dig deeper, and I know the citizen science community, we want more, Joseph, we want to dig deeper. There is ArcGIS Pro. And like a lot of tools nowadays, it's a desktop connected to the web, ideally, platform. So you can run it standalone on your local device without being connected to anything else, without being connected to the web. But it's more powerful, actually, if you connect it to the web. So ArcGIS Pro, as opposed to ArcGIS Online that has about 45 analytical tools, ArcGIS Pro has over 1,100 analytical tools, including the connection to the R statistics package and much, much more that I know we don't have time to talk about. So if people want, that they bump up against some limitations of the online and say, I really want to do this, I can't do it here. Okay, we've got other tools that allow you to do that. So yeah, good point of clarification that there is ArcGIS Pro. I, on purpose, did not include much of it in here just because I wanted people to say, I want to easily step into this without having to install anything and use these software as a service or SaaS-based tools.
Great, thank you. Another interesting question about access and moving from access to action. So a question from Ethan, who says, it's great that tools and data are becoming more powerful. How can we move from tools and data to community action, given that action requires a lot of time and trust and sometimes money?
Yeah, very good point, Ethan. And thanks for reminding me about that one, Mary. I would say a few things. And again, we could have a longer discussion, during the conference and then afterwards too, folks. I think you all know how to get a hold of me. I had my contact information, but we can all share that. But for one thing, a tool like ArcGIS Hub, which is a tool for communities, government agencies, nonprofits, and others to not only serve their data via these open data platforms, but to get community engagement. So I touched on it a little bit in the presentation, where GIS was in the not too distant past a system of records, right? Shrubs, soil type, water quality, public art, et cetera. It's things, objects, points, lines, polygons, images, et cetera, on the landscape, above and below the landscape too. On Mars too, there's GIS on Mars. But the point is, it was a system of records. And now we're moving to the system of engagement. We've got a lot of data there at our fingertips. And sure, there's more that's being gathered by you all in the citizen science community, but it's becoming this system of engagement. One of the ways that we can do that is through the hub technology. Now, you remember my slide of the Macintosh computer being used as a doorstop. And just as a reminder, I'm not all about the tools. I'm about using the most appropriate tools and methods for the job. So it's not just Hub, but it's the idea of engaging the community with Hub, Survey 123, and other tools where we can give back and have that dialogue and build a community. A couple of the links that I shared, for example, the racial equity essay of mine with the guidelines as to how do I do this? How do I engage with this? Is in this ESRI community. And it's a community of how do I get help if I get stuck? Technical help, or how do I, in the case of educators, how do I get pedagogical, thematic teaching resource help for how do I teach with these tools or this method? But I think the last thing I'll share about this, Mary, and I'm really glad that you brought this up. This is a really important part. We've always been good about wanting, and now more recently, having the ability to share data and to share results of our communication with maps, story maps, et cetera. But the more challenging thing was, how do we share the methods that we use? So if you have a wetland study, do you have to recreate the whole wheel? If you like my or someone else's model that we've created, shouldn't you be able to apply that workflow and that model to the Chesapeake or wherever it is behind you, right, to that area, and maybe adjust it for your own local variables or things you want to consider. That's traditionally been the more challenging part, but now we can even share models. Just because we can doesn't mean that people are automatically doing that. And it's going to take a little while before that becomes more commonplace. But I'm really excited about that possibility because, as you know, I mean, as this community knows, there is still far too much. I've got to go back to square one and recreate the wheel because I don't have access to anybody else's methods or the data that they used, et cetera. Wow, just think if that concept takes root, the possibilities of solving these complex problems are really in reach.
Yeah, I love that point. And I do think that's part of the mission of the Citizen Science Association, is sharing those models and methodologies to make us all more effective. So I really appreciate your touching on that. And the next question I'm going to ask is also really near and dear to my heart, and something you already addressed a little bit. This is from Cameron, who has a design background and shares that they're most excited for storytelling with the way data is displayed, but there's a lot of responsibility in data visualization for folks who don't yet know what to look for to validate information or ask skeptical questions, because of course, design choices influence understanding and assumptions. So given that, do you have any favorite resources or examples of how to do great storytelling through visual choices? Any ideas to help?
Oh gosh, several things come to mind. I mean, a couple of these resources are not new, but Cindy Brewer's Color Brewer, to make wise choices on colors on maps, especially in the digital world where it's just so easy to take the default and you get a whole bunch of color ramps, and that's great. But what if you want to go beyond the default? What if you want to choose your own? How do you do that? And why should you do that? That alone, to me, getting people to, I mean, it's great that we have these smart mapping capabilities where, you're using a platform like ArcGIS Online and you get okay, I see your data. I see the number of classes you want. Here is what the ArcGIS system, thinks is the best choice of colors and symbols and so on. That's great. It may be the most suitable choice, but you always have the choice as a data user. Everybody is a map creator now, not just a map consumer, right? So we're all creating content. As a creator of content, you can always override those defaults. And I think people should understand when it's appropriate to do so. But on a wider issue there, Mary, I think you're touching on something really important. So Cindy Brewer, you touched on it at the beginning when we were chatting. Mark Mamonier's How to Lie with Maps and other good, cartographic texts. We've got a MOOC from three of our cartographers at ESRI called the Cartography Massive Open Online Course, and they get into a lot of these, and that course is offered 2 or 3 times a year. I highly recommend it. Those folks are engaging, they're funny, they're very knowledgeable, and they do touch on those things. We've got some other resources from Aileen Buckley and other cartographers here and at other organizations. We work closely with Penn State and others to create resources about wise choices on projections, classifications, color, with story maps alone, just in that, which it's an exciting world, right? There's 2 million story maps, of a wide variety of quality, but the fact that 2 million of these have been created shows people that what we all have been trying to proclaim for years, that maps are powerful ways to tell stories. And even if you're not a cartographer or a GIS person, you can use these, for example, story maps, Calvin was talking about these earlier, to tell a really compelling story about something that you really care about in a way that maybe Prezi or PowerPoint or Microsoft Sway or other presentation tools do not quite give you. I mean, I still use those other tools, but the fact that there are so many of those out there really speaks to the whole value that people have long had for maps, right? Maps have been used to tell stories, of course, for thousands of years, but it's amazing that this is the kind of tool. A couple of people were chatting with me about this. Hey, I'm telling my family member about this. This is the kind of thing that, if you can communicate to your own friends and family, they say that that's oftentimes the most challenging, right? So if you can say to them, hey, make a story map of something you care about, or some cool places you'd like to visit, or the cool places you went maybe not last summer. We were not traveling too much, but the summer before. Then that's, I don't know, somehow that gets to, our citizen science heart, right? That you're actually being able to communicate the value of this to the non-science community, just the general public, that now is viewing maps as not just reference documents, because that's a challenge, Mary. You and I have been talking about this for years, that most people say, oh, I use maps. Where is Afghanistan? Where is Mongolia? Where is, Colorado? They're not just where things are. It's the whole, going back to John Snow and the cholera, 1854 London, looking at patterns and trying to make a positive difference in the community through maps as analytical tools, not just reference tools.
Yeah, and maps of stories too. And, working at National Geographic, sometimes I get to sit in with cartographers and designers deciding exactly how to tell a story in the magazine, for instance, using a map. And you would not, well, you would, but many people might not believe the number of choices that go into what colors to use, what weight of lines to use, what types of arrows, and how much that influences what the audience gets out of the map. So something I do love about GIS and story maps is it empowers, gives people the power to make those same kinds of decisions in telling their map-based stories, their spatial stories. And there's so much power in those decisions. So,
last little piece, Mary, I know you've got other things and we've got other things to chat about, but about 2 months ago, I finished Alberto Cairo, who is a journalism visualization professor at the University of Miami. He wrote a book called The Truthful Art. So it's all about infographics. There's a chapter on maps, but mapping kind of infuses the whole thing. But I highly encourage that because to read that, you think, oh gosh, Joseph, a book about making infographics and maps. No, it's not boring. It's extremely compelling and extremely relevant to our infographics rich society. Since people have been looking at that JHU coronavirus dashboard over the last 14 months now, maybe all of you can relate. People come to us now and say, oh, is this what you've been talking about for years? This kind of real-time data feeds and feeding these dashboards and maps. And now they're realizing, maybe for the first time, that, okay, yeah, I guess this is pretty important. People consume that JHU dashboard I think it's up to 2 trillion views, as in T.
Wow.
And then there's good reason, right? Because people needed to make decisions about, their daily behavior.
Yeah, wow. We did really learn a lot about the power of maps this past year, if we didn't already realize it. So I'm going to move on to this fairly technical question from Anne now, but I think it will have an interesting answer. So she's asking about when do you need to get institutional review board approval or some kind of waiver when you're using human subjects, when you're collecting data from people that you're going to include in something like your story map. And I know you shared a resource earlier about where to find some more information, which I think if you just sort of articulate again, like where to find this kind of specific information for different topic areas, that would be helpful. And then anything else you want to share about working with people as sources of data.
Well, here is an area where I rely on, especially the full-time academics in the community, to weigh in. I'm working on a study right now, for example, with a business professor, and we're going to survey business schools to see how they're implementing geospatial technology. That's just one study, but sure, we're going through that university's review, the IRB board, because we're going to survey individuals and their attitudes and opinions about the value of geospatial technology. I conducted a survey some years back about the implementation of GIS in K-12 education. And again, I had to go through my university's board. So yes, don't ignore that. It's still relevant. It's still important, especially based on, well, depending on what you're going to show as your final results. And it touches on, a related issue, is that now that we've got some of these tools, you and I, many of us in this community, right? We've published chapters, books, articles, and that's still a very valid way of reaching the community. But in addition to that now, right, with your study on native plants or habitat or whatever it is, you have these other tools that could potentially reach thousands of people. And so how does that affect what sometimes, technologies move faster than rules and procedures. Probably most of the time, technology moves faster. So do university review panels of various kinds and, getting the approvals, does that include some of these new technologies? So in addition to you're publishing your dissertation or your article or something like that, what does it include? Oh, and I could also make a story map with some of these results in it. Mary, I'm reminded also of I think it was in National Geographic and I touched on it in the Spatial Reserves data blog, of potential harm for geotagging photos to wildlife. The whole notion of it. Now this place is suddenly very visible to the community, and lots of people go to this location where they weren't going before, and now there's potential harm to the native plants and animals because of the convergence. I suppose it has been affected over the last year's lack of travel, but the idea of, you got to think about even things like that maybe you wouldn't have thought about before the advent of a geotagged photo that becomes, viewed by millions of people, etc. We're digging into some important things here, aren't we? Probably raising more questions than we're answering, but I hope this is helpful to get people thinking about it anyways.
Yeah, I do think, and I appreciate some of the chat that's happening, some of the comments that Liz is making in the chat too, that just thinking about the importance of ethics, talking about it together as a community, as a profession, I think is critical. And Liz is pointing out that there are some resources out there, and I hope that this conversation around ethics will continue throughout the conference and on the virtual platform and so forth. So I think that's really great. Pivoting now to, I wanted to ask about that question around, some folks were asking about open source alternatives and other tools other than Esri tools. And I know you mentioned that there are some tools that you consider really complementary to ArcGIS, things maybe like statistical packages or graphic design packages or software, and wondering if there's anything you wanted to call out there about ways to supplement what you can do with GIS.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mary. Well, let's just take a couple of things and pick that apart a bit. First of all, someone just mentioned iNaturalist. I used that with a couple of BioBlitz projects. In fact, Mary, worked with some of your Nat Geo education folks in Rocky Mountain National Park on one of those projects.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was great fun. Got to work with some middle school students. Anyway, we used iNaturalist for some of that work, and I wrote an essay about, okay, you got that data now. How do you map it then? One way is, that's the nice interoperability of some of these tools. I guess that's the correct word. Interoperability of these tools, where you can take, for example, just one example, but you can take the iNaturalist data and you can export that comma-separated value file, and then you could import that into ArcGIS Online. Why would you want to do that? Because now you want to map the attributes, you want to symbolize the soil pH or whatever it is differently across the study area or across this transect that you were sampling. I'm not going to say that all those tools are interoperable yet, right? We still have a ways to go, but even that as an example was remarkably easy to do. And ditto for the data on the globe.gov site. People have contributed to Globe for 25 years now. You can take much of that data and map it and analyze it. Again, thinking about the one point that I was making in that presentation, I'm not advocating use the tools just because they exist. Use the tools if they actually add value to your project, right? And so related to that is, I'm always advocating use the most appropriate tool for the job. Whether it's iNaturalist or Survey123 or other field tools, or in the mapping side of things. If ArcGIS Online is the most suitable tool for the platform, use it. If it's not, use some other tool. But the point is, use the most appropriate tools for the job that you're using. And that seems to resonate well with people, because oftentimes, especially with working with educators, they think that someone from a software company, from Esri, for example, we're always trying to push the tools. They're saying convert every single lesson into GIS. No, it's use these appropriately. So what's a lesson that's not as engaging as you'd like, not as spatially, spatial thinking as you'd like, or critical thinking or problem solving or inquiry. And those are the lessons that you should enhance with some of these tools that I've described today, not shoehorn it in when it's not appropriate. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. You might have existing really good resources from a variety of organizations that are perfectly suitable and meet your instructional goals. So focus over here on the ones that are not quite where you want them to be quite yet.
Yeah, I can say that actually I did just what you were describing with iNaturalist data, and I put it into a story map. I was practicing using story maps and thinking about how I could best use them to show what we were doing. And I really had a lot of fun creating a story map with iNaturalist data. And it really helped me understand my own data better too. So I appreciate the emphasis on interoperability. That's been a focus for the CSA since its very founding. And I do think we're making some progress in that regard. I wanted to ask also a question that Vincent had raised in the chat, which was about, can these tools or the tool of story maps and ArcGIS Online, can they be used for resource distribution? And I'm not sure I've captured the essence of Vincent's question, but I do think it's interesting to consider, like, what exactly can be included in and shared via a story map? Like, what other kinds of resources can be embedded in a story map?
Well, I could screen share if we had time, but you saw the story map that I was giving today, for example. I have, again, I didn't touch on all of them. I probably have about 40 embedded maps in that story map. So it's a way for you to highlight, not just link to, but highlight and give a preview of maps and apps. I also have an example. Do I have time to screen share or no?
I think so. Just pop it
okay,
right in.
Well, let me I promise to only take 60 seconds on this, because I think this, it's kind of like a map is worth 1,000 pictures if a picture's worth 1,000 words, that type of thing. So let me just share this one. And hopefully you're seeing the complete first course in modern web-based GIS. Are you all seeing that?
Yeah.
Okay, super. It's not the end all be all. It's everybody's got their own, instructional focus and the way they like to do things. But this is just an example of how do I serve up stories, data in a course. In this case, in a course. So this whole interface here, what you're seeing right here, is built with, as you maybe can see in the URL, it's with the Experience Builder, and I'll paste it into the chat box. But in each one of these, this is obviously a university course that I moved out of a learning management system into the Experience Builder so other people could access it and use pieces of it as they deem appropriate. But every one of these components in here, week 1, week 2, week 3, is a story map. So there's 37 story maps that I stitched together with the Experience Builder. And that shows you, it's just another example of how you could use these tools to in tandem. I think that, to me, that's the powerful thing about the platform, is that they work in tandem. So here, as you can see, I've got, why field work, and then I've got all of the activities actually embedded in the story map, and then all those story maps are stitched together with the Experience Builder. And remember my walkability story map. So I had the story map, and then I had a survey in there about, is your community walkable or not, yes or no, and rate it and describe it. And then I had a dashboard in there, and so there's the story map, the dashboard, and the survey. So 4 pieces of this platform embedded in one thing. And to me, that's the value. We all use tools that are sort of one-offs, don't we? And they're valuable too. I mean, I use EarthInView for like 20 years to edit my photos. It's one-touch editing, that type of thing. It's like a 4 megabyte program. And, it does the job. It doesn't connect to anything else, but I use it. And, you have Canva.com or, whatever you're using. So you've got tools that are meet your need, and they do 1 or 2 things, and they really do them well. One of the great examples, of course, is phone apps, right? They do a couple things, maybe only one thing, and they really do them well, and you find them valuable, and so you use them. The value of this web-based platform is that these components fit together. So story maps, for example, there are other story maps tools. There are other ways to make multimedia story maps. Oftentimes, though, they're produced by a very smart person working independently, and they're not connected to anything else. That the value here is that the ArcGIS story maps are connected to this bigger platform. So the tools ideally are not just meant to be used in isolation, which I think is what we need to grapple with these perplexing problems. So I just wanted to share that as just one example of how to fit these things together, in addition to the citizen science ones that I showed, including my own walkability map. Thanks.
Cool. You have some great screen shares. I wanted to also get back to Nancy's question. Nancy had asked questions about actual real-time data visualization. You answered some of it already in the Q&A section, but wanted to circle back to one part of her question, which was about real-time data validation. I think it's getting to like the questions around how do you do ground truthing, that kind of thing, and especially when you don't have much budget. So I know this is a question that applies far beyond this one session, but any thoughts to share on that?
Yeah, you folks are great. This is exactly why I was so thrilled to be involved with this. I knew you would ask hard and tough questions, and many of these, of course, they're subjects for additional whole webinars. I would say, first of all, in the Survey 123, just picking one tool, there are ways to set it up so that the author, there's several things you could do, but I'll just highlight a few. One, the author, let's say you set up a Survey 123, you can review every one of the ones that come in. I didn't do that for my walkability map, but I could have. I could have set it so that I reviewed every single one of those. And I know just from browsing around that, there's occasional, people's dogs and stuff like that. They may show a sidewalk, so it's sort of related to walkability. But, if I had set up that validation, I probably would have rejected a couple of those. But that's one way that you can do it. Another way is I really encourage people to, you don't have to write your master's thesis in these metadata documentation. But even with a story map, we've got some tools to put credits usually inside the story map, but you can also, every single one of those story maps is a web mapping application, and just like anything else in the ArcGIS Online platform, you have a metadata page. I never metadata I didn't like. Ooh, sorry, Mary. That was a bad geo pun. But anyway, the point is, you don't have to write volumes, but describe, what your sources are. I would get into this practice even if you're not going to share that layer or that map or that web mapping application, because then when you do share, you're going to be more in practice of doing it. And so just like we all, as consumers of the map data, we want people to document so that we can make a most informed decision possible. When you're producing a layer or a web map or a web mapping application, you need to do the same thing. You need to return the favor and document what your sources are and how often they're updated in the scale. And the reason why I say scale is because oftentimes people, when I observe over their shoulders and they're using these dynamic web maps and they're zooming in, sometimes I get the impression that people think that the data becomes more accurate when you zoom in. Now, sometimes there are layers that are scalable. For example, you've got typical American Community Survey census data, and you've got zip code, county, census tract, and then block group. And as you zoom into the block group level, you do get different data. But other data, right, contour lines, hydro, you really need to pay attention to the metadata, because as you zoom in, it doesn't necessarily become more spatially accurate and more complete with attributes. Even though we can zoom into 1 to 1,000, maybe we're looking at a standard, USGS topo layer at 1 to 24,000, let's say, the data doesn't become 1 to 1,000 just because you can zoom to 1 to 1,000. That's the good news, bad news, not bad news necessarily, but just things to think about when you're using these tools are great, but you got to think about all these other things. It's just because I can zoom into this scale doesn't mean the data was collected at that scale. So that's a couple of things that I would raise, but yeah, I know I didn't do it in any way complete justice. There are some good documentation. If that person emails me, I can do some digging and talk with our product development team as well. But in short, we're getting there. Again, the technology I think is moving faster than the practice, but the citizen science GIS created data, as we've talked about in the last week with the wonderful conference here, is really quite good. I mean, here in Colorado, we've got, massive problems as other places do with like pine beetle infestation. The Forest Service, and I mean, I was at these federal agencies when they brought in a lot of people from the field. They just couldn't afford to have people out in the field anymore, by and large. So the citizen science community, of course, stepped up to say, we can identify, invasive pests in forests quite good, thank you very much. And they have. And without that, we really would have been in dire straits in terms of the drop off in data. But thanks to the citizen science community and other things we've talked about today, we've had an actual increase in the data that we've had at our fingertips rather than a decrease with budgetary shortcuts and constraints.
Yeah, I do think it's been really interesting to follow the field of citizen science over the last few years and see the growth of trust in citizen science data based on, because of, I think, methodologies and protocols, statistics, and just proof of concept, people doing great work. And so that applies to everything we're talking about today too. I'm just gonna ask a couple more things before we wind down here, but I did wanna ask sort of specifically around costs. So we know for K-12 schools, ArcGIS Online can be available for free. I think there are other options that are fairly affordable, right? And also I know there's sometimes concerns around costs for data layers. And I wondered if you wanted to talk at all about like how to find good data layers that are inexpensive or free.
Well, I've got several reviews. I've come from many of those federal agencies in my past where I and hundreds of other people were collecting DEMs, digital orthophoto quads, contour lines, transportation, hydro, et cetera, for many years. And it's great to see now that data being opened up to a much wider community, no longer just the, as Calvin was indicating earlier, not just the GIS community or not just the IT community, but all of us. And I would say, first of all, that the open data movement has definitely helped. 20 years ago, when I first taught in the UK, for example, I wanted to get census data from the National Statistics Agency. Oh, Joseph, you can't get that. Oh, it's just for education. No, you can't get. You got to pay. Okay, if you really want it, you got to pay a license fee. Now, not to say that fees and royalties are not still around, and they have their purpose, to fund those agencies that were actually creating the data. So there's some nice debate there about the value of fee versus free from spatial data. I think by and large, though, people are embracing that whole notion, people in these agencies providing data increasingly, not globally to be sure, but the value of serving the data and getting it out there for the decision makers to use, general public, scientists, engineers, et cetera, is much more valuable than us actually getting a little revenue stream coming from it. That said, though, there are still, I think, valid services out there where you're paying a fee for someone to actually do some crunching of the data and deliver it to you in a format that maybe saves you time. It's the classic time versus money, right? Would it be valuable? It's kind of like service at your house, right? Would you tinker with your sink for 2 days and take off work and, hopefully get it fixed? Or do you pay someone, right, to do it in an hour or two? To me, it comes down to those practicalities. Sure, some organizations don't have any funds at all to pay for someone to actually deliver data in a digestible format for them. I totally recognize that, and but I still think it's an interesting discussion, and it's interesting to see the progression of the open data movement and with tools like ArcGIS Hub and other things we talked about to enable people to actually serve it. In the past, it was sort of the clunky FTP mechanisms. We had these big lists of data online and oh my gosh, how do we find what we want? Again, we've got a long ways to go, but we've made huge strides. And this link that I put in the chat box here, this Living Atlas, that is a subset of 8,500 or so data layers in ArcGIS Online, oceans, atmosphere, lithosphere, anthrosphere, biosphere, all kinds of themes. It's not perfect, right? We still have this oblate spheroid, right? That we're trying to represent on maps and images and 2D and 3D web maps and so on. So it's not perfect data, but it's authoritative from authoritative agencies. They all have their own, mapping accuracy standards. I know you do at Nat Geo. We did at the USGS. I mean, there's certain criteria. You can't make it. You can make data that's approaching more spatially accurate, but then it's it's that classic curve of the time involved with making the data 1% more spatially or attribute accurate is not worth the staff time. A lot of people are okay with this instead of this. And as long as you provide the metadata, they can make an informed decision. I know I'm not giving this full justice either, but I still think in some that there are arguments to be made for using a data provider that may charge you a little fee if it saves you time and staff time. Increasingly, that's, I think, a little bit less common than it was years ago. I used to, actually use, oh gosh, it was the GIS Data Depot. Maybe some of you remember that. And I would use that service because they would process a lot of government agency data and make it a little bit more digestible in GIS software. Most GIS software now has evolved to the point where, most data sets somehow, some way, and usually it's not a very arduous process anymore to get the LiDAR data, to get the UAV data, to get whatever data you want to get into your GIS, so that you can start using it. In the past, it was, you've got this whole front end of data, and manipulation, and it's messy and it's incomplete. And there's still a lot of that around, but the time to get to your analysis stage where you can actually start using it for wise decision making is shortened.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. After I was one of those who learned GIS in graduate school and found it really intimidating.
You suffered through some of the
and it's a very different experience using it now. And it's true. It does. I mean, I think the technology does make it easier to use data, even if you don't have a lot of training in GIS or a lot of familiarity or comfort with data. I've really working in education, I really see that students especially, but also teachers can learn very quickly how to use data, how to use open source data too. So,
well, yeah, and on your primary, secondary school point, Mary, most of those folks, we're not saying teach GIS to 10-year-olds, right? It's, hey, you're teaching about hurricanes or about earthquakes or about the Dust Bowl or about a historical battle or whatever it is in your social studies or your science or your math curriculum, geography, etc. Here's a way for you to do it. So it's using some of these tools, but they're not, very seldom are they actually teaching GIS per se. There are some high schools that actually have GIS courses, but more commonly around the world, it's teaching a content area, and it's aligned to their educational content standards. And it's aligned to, project-based learning and inquiry and all the things that you and I love about education. So that's the approach, just so that people that are listening to this are aware that we're not saying, hey, you need to be teaching GIS in your third grade class. No, it's using these tools, again, appropriately, along with other tools that you're using.
Yeah, that's very true. And my background is in environmental science, but I've loved to see how educators also have started to integrate GIS into teaching the social sciences as well, and social studies. So a very adaptable tool. Our time is winding down here, so I just wanted to invite Jennifer and Calvin to see if you wanted to pop back on, and if you had any final questions or comments to share before we sign out.
No, I think this presentation was really, really interesting. Thanks for sharing, Joseph. And thanks for the links too that I think came from yourself and Charmel and maybe some others. The GIS world is really big, and so is the citizen science world. And so getting connected and plugged in lets everybody kind of get in the weeds together. And I think that'll work wonders on letting people dip their toe into these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm back here as well. I'm not able to turn my video on back at the moment, but thanks for sharing all of that. And I love the way that everything is so intertwined in what you're sharing. And I don't know if it's because geography and space is just so foundational and fundamental to who we are, but we got into things about data and about learning and about ethics and all of these things that just interact with and overlay with the larger world of what we're talking about in this field, and the chance that we have to carry that forward in what we're doing as we think about the use of any of these tools was just a great conversation. So thank you for fielding that.
Well, we owe it all to you, Jennifer, and the Citizen Science Association for the platform and for the conference and for all that you do, not just these weeks right now, but throughout the year, and look forward to engaging with you and the others. You're right. We could talk about this the rest of the day, and it would still be a blast. But I know folks have other things they want to do at the conference, and rightly so. But I appreciate everybody being here today.
Well, and thank you for everything that you're doing and for the support that Esri has given to carrying these conversations forward. I really appreciate that as well. And you're right that it doesn't stop now. There is the chance to be connecting with you in the platform, with each other about these ideas, with our working groups, and with a few things that are coming up. And I will say, I think we have a slide with a couple of our upcoming plenaries and events. And if we don't, I will just rattle them off. But we started out this conversation today after your presentation, Joseph. The first question we started digging into was about racial justice and spatial justice. And next Monday's plenary is another really leading conversation on this topic. As it happens, a number of the faculty of the historically Black colleges and universities who are joining for this roundtable happen to be geographers, and will be bringing that perspective and that lens to talking about racial justice and spatial justice in the conversations that they're having about the frontline work that HBCUs have been doing in implementing citizen science and community science, and also really innovative work integrating those projects and programs into their curricula. So that's going to be a really wonderful conversation that's come out of some ongoing work that has been led by our environmental justice practitioners working group. So that's a great way to connect with folks there and keep this conversation going. There are two upcoming hidden plenaries that we'll be sharing more about that are bringing attention to volunteer voices. They're on Friday and Saturday, May 21st and 22nd, and they intersect with an event called CitSciCon. It's a public facing event, and today's email that went out had some more information about that. And then again, we have a closing plenary with Sylvia Acevedo talking about her connection to place and her personal story about young experiences growing into a career in science, in innovation and entrepreneurship. And that's just going to be a really excellent way to close out the event. But no reason to stop the conversation or focus them on the plenaries. There's a session on Wednesday. The last session on Wednesday is a meet and greet with our working groups and also our folks from CSA's journal. It's one event link and a chance to move around different breakout rooms and connect and learn what these different working groups are leading on and connect with the people there. And of course, all kinds of asynchronous opportunities to be meeting and asking questions throughout the event. Don't be shy about pinging any of the folks that you are meeting or hearing from during these sessions. That is exactly what this platform is all about. Leave them a message, ask them a question, and keep this conversation going. So we will share some more follow-ups, including this really excellent list of resources, both on this event page, and then also I mentioned in the event page for today's plenary that there's also a page of resources directly talking about Esri tools that is also worth checking out. So please go look for that page, say hello to other folks that are at this event from Esri, ask some questions there, and really we can dig into this ongoing conversation to explore these tools, storytelling, data analysis, and more. So again, thank you. You're welcome to stay with us as we chat about a couple of more ideas to close out this hour. One more thing, Calvin is going to be on a coffee break starting at the top of the hour. So join then, grab your cup of coffee, take a bio break, and then sign back on through the event link in CSA Connect, and we can again keep having these conversations and others together as a community. So thank you, Calvin, for leading this and for hanging on the line. If you want to hop off and grab your coffee and then sign on. I'll get you the link for that. He is all set and fired up and ready to go. Mary, thank you for being on and for having this conversation. It's really great to be bringing together, threading these questions throughout this really wide-ranging topic. Just casually, I am curious, one of the things that I think about when I think about maps, I think about the art of maps and the art of spatial analysis and just how beautiful they can be. I'm curious where your backgrounds are.
Yeah, mine is on the coast of Gabon, actually, a photograph by a National Geographic photographer, and I've never been there. So I put it up. I keep thinking about how much I want to go there.
And Joseph, you'll have to forgive me if you said this during your talk and I missed it. I was pulled away to do some troubleshooting for some other sessions. So humor me and tell me.
No, I didn't mention the exact coordinates, but I said Colorado and kind of waved my hand, I think, at one point. But this is Western Colorado here. My homeland is taken from, I was on the top of Mount Garfield. And, you know, sometimes when I teach about, you know, the real-time data feeds and the real-time like wildfires, this whole ridge here behind me was on fire last August, unfortunately. But, you know, the importance of, hey, you know, we can get information about that fire and where it is right now. But that's, yeah, the Manco Shale, the Green River Formation, the Pinyons and Junipers, Colorado National Monument. Yeah, that's my homeland. Thanks.
It's beautiful. I have a whole different kind of landscape behind me. This is Brooklyn. It's the rooftop of my last apartment building, not my current one. But
you got a rainbow in there, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it was, you know, surprisingly, there are some beautiful skies and really great vistas when you have a chance to go up.
Well, you're touching on, hey, you know, observe your surroundings, right? That's what we're always telling people. Use all your senses and available to you and observe, even in the city.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I owe Calvin. Okay.
How about this for a page turner?
Bolstad.
Joseph,
that's a big tone.
You were just calling me out when you said textbooks and door stops.
Yeah.
All the old good stuff.
Well, they still have their place. I love Bolstad's book. That's one of my favorite books in GIS. So yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and Lauren, I noticed in the chat that you are looking very closely at our backgrounds, and I know people have asked Calvin before where that background picture was taken. That is
yeah. So this background is an 1896 textile mill in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is also my apartment.
Cool.
So this is authentic. I got my bookshelf in there. I've got some nice windows, and yeah, it's a neat place to be for sure.
And just a reminder,
I happen to really like old spaces and patina and rusticness. I grew up in St. Louis, and there's a lot of character to those places. Charlotte was a much smaller place until very recently, and it just exploded. And so everything is kind of shiny and glass and modern. And it just has that new city smell. And so I look for some older things, and I was able to find one.
It's a beautiful spot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
It's a compliment for sure if somebody thinks your actual house is a Zoom background.
Well, I can promise you, it's only kind of this view. The living room is kind of neat. It's coated in bricks. The rest of it would not impress anyone. It's just an apartment. This won't be featured on any, Home Garden Network television shows.
Except apparently, as Joseph is pointing out here, the cover of the Pink Floyd album, maybe?
That Battersea Power Station, Calvin, you know, that big factory, it was a coal fire plant in the UK, in London. It's got the 4 big, huge smokestacks. It was on the cover of the Pink Floyd album. For those of you that don't know, that was a band. Okay, anyway, the point is, now it's apartments, and you could actually go in there, and it's like millions and millions and millions of bricks. Yeah, you'll have to make a pilgrimage.
I believe, I'm a big soccer fan, and they turned the old Arsenal Football Club stadium at Highbury into condos. And so you actually live in the old soccer stadium facing into the soccer field, which is now like a garden space, which has got to be incredibly cool.
So before we completely sign off here, I do want to call out the last comment in the chat here, not just about the book that Pam is mentioning, but the fact that Pam has been behind the scenes for this whole event, helping to curate and bring into the conversation, hi Pam, all of the questions from everyone, from the chat, from the CSA Connect site, from the Q&A tools. So Pam, thank you again, and thank you to the CitSciVirtual Plenary Committee for the organization and the work that you put into doing this. So glad you're here. Yay.
Yes, it's fun.
And also behind the scenes, Liv Vega and all of the folks at AV Technic who have been running this. So thanks everybody. I know we need to draw this to a close now, but see you on the coffee hour. If you're joining there, glad to, as always, keep these conversations going.
Thank you all very much for your support.
Thanks, everybody.
Joseph,
Map
thank you
on.
again. Great.